On this week's episode, we considered entering up, up, down, down, left, right, BA, select, start. But who wants 30 lives in 2020? Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Anxiety Monkeys podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and joining me here in the studio is my co-host, Michelle.
Good morning, everyone. This episode is so near and dear to my heart and just brings back so many memories of my misspent youth.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the video game crash of 1983. Now, believe it or not, this wasn't the actual first video game crash. That happened in 1977 when a company figured out how to make cheap chips that were used in the Pong system. This basically caused a flood in the market and ultimately led to a crash. In the aftermath of the crash, the Atari 2600 became the dominant system on the market. But there were other systems as well. But the thing that they all had in common is that these were all cartridge-based games. So instead of buying one dedicated system for one game, connecting it to your TV, and that's basically all that you had, you now had systems where you could swap out different games. The problem was that the Atari 2600 had no internal protection whatsoever. It didn't take long for people to figure out how to reverse engineer the system and develop their own games without going through licensing through Atari. So this led to a flood of cheap, non-licensed games. In the words of one analyst at the time, everything under the sun was licensed. But what we ended up with was basically 10% of the games on the market accounted for 75% of sales, and there were so many games out there that retailers didn't have enough floor space available for all the games being released. Now, non-licensed games were a problem, but Atari didn't do themselves any favors. They fucked up a release of Pacman, and right around that same time they put E.T. on a 6-week production schedule. Now, when it comes to E.T., I don't blame the developer, Howard Scott Warshaw. He did what any of us would have done in our 20s. You know, if our boss had come in and said, hey, here's an impossible task for you to perform, can you do it? What are we going to say? No? None of us have that luxury. So credit where credit's due. I think he did the best he could with what he had on hand. Now, Atari planned to sell about 4 million copies of the E.T. game. I'm not sure if they hit that, but what I do know is that 3.5 million copies got returned. I don't know if these were sold and then returned to the store and then returned to Atari, or if the bulk of them were just never sold to begin with. But the upshot was that Atari ended up burying about 750,000 copies of E.T. in a landfill in New Mexico. I wouldn't even go so far to say that this was the straw that broke the camel's back, so much as it was just a symptom of the overall problem with the industry. But in the aftermath, game companies shut down, retailers went out of business, even arcades weren't immune. But in the aftermath of all of this did pave the way for the introduction of the Nintendo Entertainment System, because in Japan, they experienced the crash as well. They called it the Atari Shock, but it wasn't nearly as disastrous for them as it was for us. So they introduced the NES, which broke the slump, cemented Japan's role in the game industry, and basically there were several changes that Nintendo actually learned lessons from the crash. They developed a pretty robust licensing system that was pretty hard to break. There were a few companies like Tengen that were able to release their own unlicensed games, but for the most part, Nintendo had a stronger hand with their seal of quality and things like that in ensuring that the market wasn't flooded. In addition to looking at content, they initially had a quota system where you could only release 5 games per year. They did relax that towards the end of the Nintendo Entertainment System's lifespan, and while Atari never really did recover from the crash of 1983, Nintendo did become a dominant market force even in the face of competition from companies like Sega and later on Sony and Microsoft. Which kind of brings us to the point that I want to make. Call it an unpopular opinion if you will, but I think that the video game industry's kind of become a victim of its own success, and we may be overdue for another crash. Now, I'd be the first to acknowledge the harm done with the crash of 1983, but there are certain bad actors that need to be chased from the market. Let's start with mobile games. First of all, I think we've pretty much discovered the limits of mobile gaming. The Nintendo Switch is a pretty decent system with a pretty decent library of games, so I'm not arguing against that, but I am talking about the cell phone market here. On the one hand, you've got Apple's walled garden market, which I think is too restrictive. On the other end, you've got the Google Play Store, which is basically a Wild West environment where pretty much anything goes, which leads to a couple of companies, just as examples, that really need to be shot into the sun. One being a game company that put out a game called Evony, which, they stole assets from Age of Empires to create a Civilization clone, and then tried to get people to come play it by using images of lingerie models. Like, hey, here's some tits, come play our Civilization clone. So, not great there. Another one that was actually pulled off the market, at least I think it was pulled off the market in Great Britain and the rest of Europe, was a game called Homescapes, where you'd see these ads pretty much everywhere, for what looked like a puzzle game, pull pins to release treasure or make choices to save characters from perilous situations, only to download the game and discover that, hey, this is just yet another Match 3 game, which Match 3 games are probably about the only format of game that really works on mobile. I've tried a couple of different games. I've got Grand Theft Auto San Andreas and a couple of other ones. And as impressed as I am that they were able to get Grand Theft Auto San Andreas working on a device that fits in my pocket, the controls are a hot mess. It makes gameplay pretty much impossible. You need a controller for games like that. And controller support for Android devices has been kind of wonky at best.
So, I know you play Mario Kart on the cell phone. What do you think about it?
That one I think is another example where they kind of get it right. The controls are fairly basic, so it works well with a mobile device. But there's really not a whole heck of a lot of challenge to it. So it's good for killing time, but I really wouldn't think of it as like a great game. Which kind of brings me to one of my preferred platforms, console games. For years, I started out pretty much, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and we're up to owning a Nintendo Switch and a PlayStation 4. We've been pretty deep in the console market for most of our lives, and I'm seeing trends in the console market that I also, it's turned me off of console gaming in a big way. One thing I don't much care for are these so-called loot boxes where you spend real money. It's basically an electronic form of gambling. You spend money to get these loot boxes, opening them up, hoping to get great gear for whatever game you're playing, but with the real risk that you're just going to end up with another cosmetic item.
Now, this reminds me of what Bethesda has done with Fallout 76.
Oh, God, yeah, Fallout 76 was a steaming pile. They kind of went into that one with a cash grab mentality in mind, I think, but with no real clear roadmap of how they were going to do it. So they made promises that they couldn't keep. They've kind of turned it into a play-to-win sort of game, and they've really penalized people who've been with them for the long haul. I don't think that anybody hearing about the Fallout franchise for the first time would necessarily buy into what Bethesda was trying to do with it, but I think a lot of us who'd been with them for quite some time were willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, and we got a broken, steaming pile as a thank you for our efforts.
So, I have another question.
Sure.
Has Borderlands done this too?
Not to the extent that Bethesda did. If Take-Two's guilty of anything, it's the season pass thing that I'm not terribly wild about. The basic idea is that you pay $60-$70 for a video game, and then on top of that they want you to pay another $50-$60-$70 for bonus content. Now in Take-Two's defense, some of the season pass content is really good. I'm thinking of Borderlands 2 and a season pass piece called Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon's Keep, which definitely felt like bonus material. But there's an argument for wanting to get the complete finished product at one price and paying that one price one time. There's other companies that use that same model that really don't do as good a job of it. One example of that would be Midway with Mortal Kombat 11. Here we are, 2 years after the game launched, and they're still introducing characters.
And also, I feel that Blizzard does a similar setup with each edition of downloadable content and upgrading the game.
Are you talking about World of Warcraft?
Yes.
Yeah, with the bonus content that Blizzard releases, it definitely feels like kind of a standalone product that pairs with the content that you paid for in the first place. So it's kind of a balancing act. There are some companies that definitely do it well, and I think there's other companies that do it just as an excuse to put their hands in our pockets.
And I don't mean to be targeting Blizzard with this, but Blizzard is the best example that I can think of at this time, where they just keep coming up with new content and new things and just keep feeling the need to soak up their subscribers' pockets even more. I mean, for example, new mounts, being able to buy gold, weapons, and everything else. And I mean, just Jesus Christ, I understand having to cover your costs, but I'm paying you a subscription fee. I should be able to get something added to that for nothing. Don't just feel like giving me, what I've paid for. Give me something extra. You're charging me a monthly fee.
Yeah, absolutely. At their peak, they had something like 12 million subscribers paying $15 a month. It seems to me that charging an extra $40, every time you come out with a new expansion is a little over the top. If nothing else, not charging extra for that expansion content would probably help with player retention. And on that note, we're going to go check the auction house to see what sold today. While we're doing that, why don't you hang out and enjoy this word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Pages Printed Plastics. You can visit us at pagesprintedplastics.com. That's P-A-I-G-E-S, printedplastics.com. We have a couple of different printers. We can do design as well as print. We can print anything from small figures like D&D miniatures to larger objects like computer parts, toys, props, pretty much anything you can imagine. So feel free to check us out. Again, that's pagesprintedplastics.com.
And welcome back! As you can tell, this is my segment, and I've decided to cover a bit of a background history of Pacman to celebrate Pacman's 40-year anniversary.
Oh, great. So we can share midlife crises together.
Given that Pacman has been around so long, it's just amazing that it has survived and grown and just prospered in so many years. Granted, during the time, a lot has been done with the franchise, and a lot of adaptations have been made, and some of them have been crap. But some of them have stuck true to it and survived. So, here we go. The original Pacman was released in 1980. It was originally released in Japan and eventually made its way here to the States. And the Americans just grabbed onto it with both hands and loved it. It was made to attract women gamers. Most of the games created around that time were designed for men, violent and just destructive,
and also played with our genitals.
But don't get me wrong, there's nothing like a good GTA game. And the way the creator made it,
Toru Iwatani wanted to make a game that would appeal to women as well as men.
And the way Pacman was designed was he was trying to figure out a design for his new game, and he was hungry. And so during a lunch break, he wandered into a pizzeria and he ordered a pizza. And he took a slice from the pizza, and it struck him and it inspired him that the wedge shape missing from the pizza resembled a hungry mouth. And he decided to create Pacman from that. Having decided upon the character design, Iwatani derived its name from paku paku, a Japanese
onomatopoeia
for eating. The same sound that happens to have inspired the game's signature soothing Waka Waka sound as Pac-Man gobbles dots and fruit, thanks to a licensing and distribution deal with Bally Midway that manufactured pinball machines and arcade games. Within a year and a half, Namco sold 350,000 Pac-Man cabinets, the equivalent of 2.4 billion, and keep in mind that's a B, not an M, in sales today. By 1982, Americans were pouring an estimated $8 million worth of quarters into Pac-Man each week.
Jesus.
That's a lot of quarters.
Isn't it, though?
And I wonder how much of that is for me. As the 1990s drew to a close, Pac-Man sales surpassed 2.5 billion, making it the highest grossing video game in history. And in 1982, you all know the song Pac-Man Fever, that went and became a top 10 radio hit. In 1981, GCC, General Computer Corporation, created Crazy Auto, which was inspired by Pac-Man.
Now, that was a mod pack for Pac-Man, and mods back in that day weren't like they were today, where you do some coding, you work in Lua or whatever, and develop some software mods. These were actual hardwired boards that were soldered together and wired into the machines directly.
That is correct. They're hardwired into the cabinets, and Bally Midway saw this as an infringement upon their creation, and they reached out to the creators of this mod, and they ended up buying the rights to Crazy Auto, and this Pac-Man was born.
Now, I find that kind of interesting because if I remember correctly, the mod for Crazy Auto was basically Pac-Man with legs. So they buy the rights to it and turn around and create Ms. Pac-Man, which if you look at the old arcade cabinets, it's a Pac-Man with legs on the marquee art, but in the game,
the legs no longer exist.
Right, exactly. It's just a Pac-Man with a little bow on its head.
That is correct. And unfortunately, to touch on our earlier segment, Ms. Pac-Man was a victim of the crash. In 1983, unfortunately, the crash happened, and Miss Pac-Man was one of the video games that was affected by the Atari terrible crash.
Well, if I remember correctly, too, the problem there was that this was a direct release from Atari, and it was just buggy as hell.
That is correct.
Well, while Michelle and I go gobble some dots and fruit, why don't you guys kick back and enjoy this word from our sponsor? Today's episode is brought to you by Pages Printed Plastics. You can visit us at pagesprintedplastics.com. That's P-A-I-G-E-S, printedplastics.com. We have a couple of different printers. We can do design as well as print. We can print anything from small figures like D&D miniatures to larger objects like computer parts, toys, props, pretty much anything you can imagine. So feel free to check us out. Again, that's pagesprintedplastics.com. And we're back. In more recent video game news, the PlayStation 5 has launched. Now, I know Microsoft has also released the latest iteration of the Xbox, but I got to apologize up front. I'm more of a PlayStation guy. I always have been. I never really got into the Xbox. So looking at the PlayStation 5, one of the things I see right off the bat is that they've included an 825 gigabyte solid-state disk drive. Now, this is a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you get faster load times and in theory, the elimination of loading screens. But on the other hand, given that game sizes have only increased and that the trend towards digital downloads continues, this isn't necessarily a good thing. On the other hand, the claim from Sony is that with this solid-state disk drive, they can compress games even further, making them smaller, taking up less space on the hard drive. You can also add an M2 drive to your PlayStation 5, but those aren't actually on the market yet. So whether this is a good thing kind of remains to be seen. It looks like it's marketing at about $500, which the price point isn't terrible. Tech-wise, it's pretty much an overall improvement over the PS4, which I'm going to take as pretty much a given at this point. The Xbox Series X does have a slight edge in processing power, but I'm not entirely sure that that really matters. Both sides seem to be relying on an increase in cloud-based gaming and digital downloads. Now that would work for us. We're in an area with a pretty decent internet setup, but as we've seen with COVID-19, high-speed internet access isn't a given in the US, and there are still places that just are not well served. So this could end up costing them sales. So I guess the question is will I be getting one? It's kind of irrelevant at this point. You can't get them for love or money unless you're willing to do business with resellers, and frankly, I'm not willing to do that. The other thing to consider is that I generally don't trust anything with a single-digit serial number. We got bit pretty hard when we bought a PlayStation 2 shortly after it came out on the strength of Grand Theft Auto 3 and the latest Final Fantasy, which I think was Final Fantasy X. A couple of years later, the PS2 ended up dying on us because the optical drive fritzed. This was an issue that Sony knew about, but apparently they couldn't be asked to do a recall. The only way we found out about it was because we contacted them to see about getting it repaired, and they informed us, oh yeah, yours is, on recall. So on the strength of that, I'm willing to wait. In addition, I've taken a look at some of the trailers for some of the upcoming games, both launch titles and titles that are anticipated to come out early next year, and there's nothing that really screams at me, hey, you've got to have me. So I can afford to wait. So in the meantime, I've been playing a lot of emulated games. RetroArch for the Windows system is currently my jam. Now, RetroArch is kind of an interesting thing. You can get it on a variety of platforms. I have it on Windows, I have it on Android, I also have it on a couple of Raspberry Pi units that I have floating around. Basically, the idea for retro gaming, it used to be that you'd have to download an individual emulator for whatever system you wanted to emulate, track down the ROMs, and play each game, through its specific emulator. RetroArch gets rid of a lot of that. It consolidates all of your emulators, they call them cores, into the RetroArch system. It does a really decent job of managing your ROM files. The only thing that I really don't like is that they really don't have light gun support nailed down yet. There's a couple of workarounds using Wiimotes or custom guns that you can buy on the internet, or the light bar from the Wii, but there really isn't like a simple, elegant solution that works across all platforms. The other thing I like about RetroArch is that there's kind of a user community behind it that decided that what retro games needed was achievements. So I can go through, play games that I enjoyed as a kid, and now get achievements for them. I am currently playing Lufia and the Fortress of Doom for the Super Nintendo. I just finished The Legend of Zelda Link to the Past yesterday. So that's what I'm playing. Well, folks, that's going to do it for us this week. Thank you for joining us. You can find us on most of the major podcast markets. Hopefully next year we'll be on Amazon Podcasts. That remains to be seen yet. So if you can find us on your podcast market of choice and give us a 5-star review, that helps other people find us. We're on Twitter at AnxietyMonkies, Facebook at facebook.com/AnxietyMonkies, and you can email us at anxietymonkeys@gmail.com. And finally, if you've got a couple of bucks you want to throw our way, you can do that at patreon.com/AnxietyMonkeys, or go in for a one-time donation at paypal.me/AnxietyMonkeys. Until next week, she's Michelle, I'm Rob, and we're your Anxiety Monkeys.